don't really know about it. I might be able to bullshit my way through it in front of some undergrads, but I don't really know what I'm doing.
Yeah. That's what you learn in graduate school, right?
That's it.
Mostly sound like you know what you're talking about when speaking with people who know even less than you.
Yeah.
The more I teach, the more I learn. That's exactly what it is.
So, you guys probably know Paul Lansky, my senior colleague here. He had this great bit of advice for teaching. He said, "Never let on."
That's great. Never let on anything because it can only lead to tears.
That's right. Yeah.
So thank you. Dan Trueman is joining us, and we really appreciate your time. We've been listening to Nostalgic Synchronic a lot. When did this come out?
Today.
Just today. Well, we have excellent timing. It's been in my. I often lose track of the actual, what the cool kids call the street date is because it sits in my email box for long enough. I just assume that by the time I get to it, it's been out for 8 months.
I know what you mean. Yeah.
So we should say that Nostalgic Synchronic is a collection of etudes for an instrument that I'm going to go ahead and say that you invented, the digital prepared piano. Mm-hmm. And this is an interesting concept, as you have acknowledged in some of the things that you've written about it, because in some regard, every digital piano in particular is prepared in some way, because we have to, it doesn't make noise on its own. We have to assign it a sound. Mm-hmm. So tell us, for those that are hearing this phrase for the first time, what you mean when you say digitally prepared piano.
Right. And I'm going to be annoying and nitpicky for a moment, but I think it's actually useful in terms of the idea of it. I actually call it a prepared digital piano.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. No, it's fine. And the reason I say that is that, I think about a digitally prepared piano, and it sounds like it would be a real piano with like some kind of digital machines on the actual piano. Whereas this is a digital piano, but I've done what I think of as prepared it in a way roughly analogous to the way we prepare an acoustic piano. So, an acoustic piano, we stick things between the strings and so on in order to make individual strings sound different and respond differently. And the reason I call this a prepared digital piano is that while I was building it and starting to compose for it, the process felt very similar in that I was constantly picking individual notes and giving them special behaviors, so that then when I went and played the instrument, certain notes would respond in certain ways, while other notes might just sound like a normal piano. And so even though I'm not doing really anything remotely like preparing a piano, and I'm not making it sound like a prepared piano where you get those sort of beautiful buzzy gong sounds and so on, I'm not doing anything quite like that, but it still feels similar in that I'm making individual keys respond in ways that are really totally different than the way a regular piano responds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there were some things that I noticed that were really interesting in terms of microtonality and reversed samples that obviously cannot be done easily in real time. Could you talk a little bit about your desire to use those as opposed to some of the more traditional prepared piano techniques like rubber mallets, bouncing balls, spraying the swashers?
Yeah, and it's not that I'd rather do the things that I did than some of the other cool things that we could do. It's more that I ended up there, and I don't know how it is with you guys, but whenever I'm making something, I often get distracted at a place that I don't expect to get distracted. So I'll be making something with the aim of getting from point A to point B, and then I'll end up a quarter of the way there and find something really interesting and get stuck there and then make a bunch of music with it. So basically that's what happened here. And can I give a little prehistory maybe?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So the funny thing is the instrument really began as part of a percussion project. Several years ago, I made a piece for So Percussion, the wonderful Brooklyn-based percussion quartet, although I should say they are also in residence at Princeton here now, which is very exciting for us to get to hang out with them on a regular basis. But I made this piece for them some years ago called Neither Anvil Nor Pulley. And one of the instruments, one of the movements, was based on a really dead simple idea. Although it took me 3 months to come up with it. But that's another story. Basically, it was the dead simple idea was a resettable metronome. The ability to have a digital metronome going that you would play against, but you could periodically reset its starting point. And so it becomes interactive in the dopiest possible way, but in an extraordinarily fun way. It's amazing what kinds of musical and rhythmic things can emerge just by improvising with a metronome that you can reset that way. And I think, all of us musicians have had lengthy experiences with metronomes, and metronomes a certain kind of time that is a very powerful and interesting, and definitely not the same kind of time that we feel as musicians. Even a group like So, I mean, they're super well trained, but they're not metronomes, and so there's this really interesting tension between the way metronomes, the way we make metronomes, and the way they assert a sense of time, and the way we actually make music. And so basically the premise for this one movement in this piece for So Percussion was to have 4 resettable metronomes with these 4 virtuosos playing them and exploring what kind of ideas could come out. So much fun. Now, one thing that I also built into this instrument, which is, again, led directly to this piano, was a sampled pipe. So they play with these cut pipes, and I put a pickup on one and set it up so that every time you struck one of those pipes, the computer would start to sample it. But it would also measure how much time is left for the next metronome click. So it would say, okay, let's say the next metronome click is 1 second away. I'm going to sample this pipe for half of a second, and then I'm going to start playing that sample backwards so that it peaks at the strike that I just hit at the next metronome strike. This was also really fun, and maybe not quite as stupid as the simple resettable metronome, but really, really fun, in part because it gave you a little bit of a sense of when that metronome strike was coming. A click. The digital metronomes are particularly frustrating because, unlike these mechanical ones where you can see it going back and forth, you really don't have anything. I mean, sometimes they build in little lights and so on, but you don't have anything sonic. And so this pipe sound, you know the sound because you just hit it. You really can develop an intuition for when the next metronome strike is coming, which is very useful when if the tempo, for instance, is very slow. So in that piece, the tempo gets down to 30 beats per minute, which is just slower than we can sync to. So having that reverse pipe sort of giving you some anticipation was really interesting. And you could also they would detune on the fly, so that you might have a pipe that's tuned to G, but over the course of the piece, the reverse part of it might be transposed to different pitches, so I could get different chords coming out from the reverse pipes. Wow. So there's a long prehistory to the piano, but basically,
great.
The idea was, well, I want to explore this in a more methodical way, and sitting in my studio here, and of course I have a piano hooked up to my computers. The piano is basically a bunch of buttons, so I can, play it without having to hook up a pickup to a pipe and all this stuff. And so it was just there. I mean, I say this, I love the piano, but it was more like the piano was handy. And so I just set it up so that I could, so to speak, sorry for that. Just as an aside, I've been making an iPad version of this instrument, and we've been referring to it as handy as well for obvious reasons. So it's sort of in my vocabulary to have handy things at the moment. Sorry. But with the piano, I thought, well, okay, let's just set up this resettable metronome, except having piano notes instead of just a digital click. And so I just said, basic idea, I could play a chord or an arpeggio, and the computer would collect those notes and then turn those into a metronome pulse. So you get this periodic chord coming back at you. But again, like with the piece for So Percussion, every time I play, I can reset the metronome so that it will follow me to some extent.
Nice.
And then I really liked the reverse pipe for a bunch of reasons, and so I built in this other aspect where I could have a reverse piano sound synchronized with that metronome. And so that was the first version of this piano, basically just mapping that percussion instrument into the keyboard with that interfacing with those sounds.
Okay.
What I think is really interesting about the relationship between this piece and the other one that you're talking about, neither anvil nor pulley, is that in that piece you've got a click sound in the track, and the players are making click-ish sounds with like woodblocks and stuff. And the difference here is that the only thing that ties this to piano sounds is that the keyboard structure, that electric digital keyboard instrument, is shaped like the piano that that we know and love. But it could be any sound that comes out of there, and you specifically narrowed the focus to a piano sound. And I wonder if that's something that you thought about, like the visual of seeing a piano keyboard and making pianistic sounds.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And at some point with this instrument, we're going to have other sample libraries and sounds and so on, and also it could be made just to work with an input signal, the way the instrument does for the So Percussion piece. So it could be, you're right, it could be anything. But the piano, I mean, it's iconic. I mean, it's what it is. I mean, it stands for something that is just huge and historical, and it conjures all this repertoire. And it's just beautiful. I mean, the sound of a piano. I mean, I'm not a pianist. I'm a terrible pianist, but the sound of a piano is just righteous. So, but there's that, and I think that's one of the reasons why. Yeah, I had the piano in front of me, and like I said, I just sort of stopped at certain places, and working with piano sounds was in some ways the most obvious, easy thing to do. But it does have this benefit of staying in this very focused place that we really know so well. And I think, we recognize some of what's different about these pieces in this instrument because it's in this extraordinarily familiar place. So that was a choice that I stuck with now for a number of years, and I'm probably going to stick with it for a bit longer because it hasn't gotten boring yet.
And I love it that with this piece you do draw that specific relationship between the prepared digital piano that you've made and the prepared piano that John Cage and other people have worked with. However, I have to imagine that there's much less reliance on the performer with your piece, like in terms of setup. With preparing a piano, they have to do all the screws, do all the stuff, and like spend a lot of time getting the sounds. But I understand that for this piece, you've made a piece of software that they can download and have a big MIDI controller and just play it, and it's good to go.
That's right. It's stupid easy, which I'm very proud of, actually, making software instruments that are easy to use is not easy.
Easy enough that I was able to use it.
Oh yes,
I downloaded it about an hour ago and was playing around with it here on my little dingus, and it was a lot of fun. And it was great.
Cool. Yeah, and I'm we're trying to make it even easier. So we have an iPad version which is currently under review at the App Store. Hopefully, will be out in the next few days.
Cool.
Nice.
And it's interesting. It's really. It is even easier when it's on the iPad. There are things you just don't have to deal with. Just being able to touch the interface and play with it and get an idea of it is so easy without having to plug anything at all.
Yeah.
And we're going to make an iPhone version of it as well, because it's actually not that computationally expensive to run.
Okay.
And so if we can get it on an iPhone, then I feel like it'll be so easy for people to just try it out. And we have a better shot at reaching people who would actually find this an interesting thing to do, be a fun thing to play with. So, it's a good point. And I think it's not necessarily a good thing. I mean, I think one of the beauties of the prepared piano is that it engages the player in an interesting way, and that you really do. You invest, you buy the preparations, you place them just so to get your own particular sound. On the other hand, my hope is that people will do that with this instrument. We're trying to make it so that it's not just about people playing my pieces or people listening to my pieces. It's the hope is that, and it's happened already to some extent, but the hope is that as it gets more and more accessible, that people will use it and they'll build their own preparations. They'll go in and they'll design different sorts of patterns and sounds with the instrument, ones that I never would have thought of, so that it can be somewhat similar to what Cage's piano does, but more from a sort of compositional instrument building perspective.
That's actually something that I think is really interesting about the piece, is that it is one software package and one set of sounds for a collection of pieces in much the same way that Cage has a single preparation or a long series of pieces, and you're not, so often in electronic music we're creating this really complex application to play a 6-minute piece of music, and then that's what that application was for, and now we go to the next one, and it's probably one of the reasons that they never get so easy to use. They never get the polish that you were talking about for this piece. But I think that's a great way to think about the software as well, is to say that I am making an instrument here, and that's one thing, and I am making that instrument with a particular creative output in mind, but that may not be the only use for this instrument.
Cool. I'm glad you like that. No, you're right. I mean, I've spent years making instrument things, and this is by far the most polished it's ever gotten.
Cool.
It's with a lot of people who do this. I would make things for myself, and I did a lot of improvising with electronics, and I think it's great. It's a great practice. It's a fun thing to do. It's musically really inspiring. But generally, when I make something in that context, it gets sort of half done. It's never something that anybody else could ever use or would ever use. And I went through a somewhat painful process of changing that practice when, almost 10 years ago now, we started the Princeton Laptop Orchestra here, which was a wonderful and crazy and terrible idea all at once. One of the things about it was that I was forced, and a lot of the people I worked with were forced as well, to try to make things that other people could use, and not just make things for ourselves.
Now,
and
just to
go ahead, yeah.
interject really quick, is that because it's a function of the user interface or the controller that a particular person might be using, or a combination thereof?
Yeah, a combination, and even just the functionality of it. I mean, when I've made things in the past that are interesting enough for me to improvise with and to throw into a sync that includes 7 or 8 or 10 other things.
Yeah.
That's different than really taking one thing and developing it further and seeing really how far you can go with it musically. So I think I used to have things that were, the kitchen sink of very primitive things that I had made, and that kitchen sink might be really interesting and wonderful, but sort of very personal also, not something that would make sense for me to share. And that's related to this whole choice about it really being a piano, being the piano sound, being in this very focused place that everybody knows. In some ways that enforced a sort of discipline on me in terms of the kinds of things that I would do or develop or explore, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Following up on that, this is obviously written in Max MSP. Does using that influence your design process in a similar way to deciding on the use of the piano sounds and the standard keyboard layout?
So, it looks like it's made in Max MSP. It's actually mostly not made in Max MSP. So the GUI is all written in Max MSP. It's true, and I use Max, and I've used it for many years. The actual guts of the instrument is made in a language called Chuck.
Okay.
And cool. Chuck is a text-based programming language for music.
Yep.
That was made here at Princeton back when the Laptop Orchestra started. It's a really beautiful language, and it's also a complementary language to Max. I think they're just fundamentally totally different. Max, I'm just going to say what I know about it and not presume that you don't know these things, but I'll say them anyhow. But so Max is sort of a steady state environment, right? You make something and it goes and it sort of acts as an instrument. It behaves in a steady way. You give it some input and then it gives you some output. Chuck actually won't do anything at all until you tell time to go forward. It has built into it a very strong notion of time. And so there are things that are really natural to do in Max that are very hard to do in Chuck, and vice versa. So, and I think I'm getting back to your question, if I understood it correctly. The languages themselves absolutely encourage certain types of work. And this instrument, going back to when I built it originally for percussion, I never would have done it in Max. It came out of a creative, iterative process of programming in Chuck. And it's doable in Max. I mean, you can basically do anything in either one of these languages, but it's how it looks and it's the process of finding things in those languages. I tend to stumble on things that I like, and you're going to stumble on different things in Chuck than you are in Max, and vice versa. And so personally, that was sort of transformative when I learned Chuck finally, to have that as a complementary tool to working with Max, just to give me another way of experimenting with things, and also to keep me honest. I mean, you work with Max or any tool long enough, and it just shapes your worldview. And the world looks different because of the tools you use. And I remember the first thing I tried to do when I learned Chuck was to port some things that I used in Max, port them to Chuck. And I got halfway done and I realized, wait, I should stop here because this looks totally different in Chuck, and I can find and use different things here. So, nice. Was that your question? Am I getting back to your question?
Oh yeah.
Oh, definitely.
Okay, cool.
And this feels so timely personally for me. I've been having trouble with my rig. I've been a pure data guy for a really long time, and I'm just before the show I was like, guys, I'm finally gonna do Max. But I hadn't even heard about Chuck. This sounds like a really interesting piece of software, and I totally hear what you're saying with the way it shapes everything, the direction of things.
More importantly, is it open source?
Yeah,
It is.
It is.
Yeah. Chuck is open source. It's free and open source.
Cool.
Yeah, and I've never gotten around to learning it since I've always used Macs with Super Collider.
Oh, yeah.
Something
I
like
see.
that.
So that's a great combination, too.
Yeah.
Super Collider and Mac and Chuck are more similar to each other than Macs is to either of them.
Okay.
But Chuck looks quite different than Super Collider. Well, this could get nerdy so quickly. I don't know how nerdy you guys want to get.
Absolutely. No
Let's
problem.
start reading lines of code. Curly bracket. var equals.
Don't forget the semicolon, guys. Okay.
Hey, can we carry out the rest of the interview in a programming language? That would work for me.
Let's just use Java from here on out.
Yeah, absolutely.
But in any case, and I mean, there's so many parts of this that, like, technically there are so many challenges and so many choices, and directed, like having it work on an iPad, moving toward doing it on an iPhone, working with the Apple Store, working with, I don't know what kind of wrappers you're putting everything in to get it into that kind of format to make it available that way. But it's just for somebody who's interested in doing the piece, I imagine that this is a wonderful service that you're doing for those people that end up performing.
You know, it's funny. I just yesterday, Adam Slewinski, the pianist who recorded all these for this record, and also a member of So Percussion, he was just here, and I showed him the iPad version for the first time, and he was so excited.
Yeah.
And it's funny how the packaging just makes a huge difference. And he's like, wow, I need this now because it just makes his practicing easier. He feels like he can take it anywhere and set up and practice and doesn't have to deal with just that one added layer of setup. And you know, this does go back again to my experiences with the laptop orchestra. One of the things that we did, and we did it iteratively again several times, was we designed the core systems that all the members of the orchestra would use. And I remember from the outset, we had a very strict cable count in terms of the number of things that could be plugged in. If it exceeded 3, it was not going to be usable because there were going to be too many things that were going to break, and it was going to take too long for everybody to set it up. So we're like constantly trying to minimize the number of things. And the difference between having it on a laptop and on an iPad is similar. It's like, you plug it into your laptop, and you still often have to install a driver for whatever keyboard you might have. There's just little things that go wrong. And even on the iPad, you can just touch the screen and get sound from it right away. There's a little keyboard right on the screen. So there's an immediacy and an accessibility that is really important. And it's been important to me for a while now. I like for other people to play with these things that I make. And I hate it when there are annoying little things that prevent them from doing it. You know, my sister's a really good pianist, and she's actually been writing some pieces for this instrument, but she's not into technology at all. And every little barrier she ran into, just drove me crazy because, like, I don't want her to have to struggle with these things. I want her to be able to just make music with it. And so, that's what we're trying to do with the iPad and iPhone versions.
I love the 3-cable rule.
Yes. There's the episode title right there. I have a sort of an interest in, to be clear, I am not nearly as technologically savvy as Dave, and certainly Nate or Ben. I'm kind of like the guy who uses electronics. I'm walking along the beach and I find a piece of electronics and I'll pick it up and hit something with it and see what kind of noise it makes, right?
Like the monkeys in 2001.
Exactly.
And Sam's selling himself short because he's got some wonderful pieces that use like a loop station and effects pedals and things.
Yeah, I mean, I'm good at using off-the-shelf technology because it has an owner's manual that explains how to use it, right?
And also it doesn't require software updates.
That's right.
Yes.
So I'm asking this, I guess, because we've been talking on the show a little bit recently about indeterminacy. And since you're invoking Cage and prepared piano, certainly that's an aspect of of Cage's music. But with electronic stuff, I guess the most profound example being I made an electronic piece. Here it is on CD, right? So that limits the indeterminate element as much as possible. But it seems like in this music, there's a lot of indeterminacy that could be baked into it. Like, for instance, I have a Roland digital piano in my office, and there's been a lot of work going on that's been fluctuating how well grounded and how constant my electricity is. And it really changes how that piano sounds when I'm playing composition pieces by my students, right? I just wonder if at all the indeterminate element that could be present in this kind of piece has entered into your mind, and whether or not that's something you consider from a compositional standpoint.
Yeah, it's a great question. And when I was building my own instruments for myself to play, I worked with indeterminacy a lot. I would have, buckets of things that whatever algorithm I was working with would randomly choose from, and the instruments would come back with surprises that I would then respond to and mess with as a performer. Talk about the power fluctuations. I'm a violinist primarily, and I've done a lot with sensors on my violin bow, and the sensors are always breaking in various states of disrepair. And so I remember one show where the sensor broke in the middle of a performance, in the middle of an improvisation, and it broke in the most unfortunate way. It broke sending out a maximum value instead of a minimum value. So the whole thing sort of was, for the rest of that set, we were just at this maximum density volume because that's what the sensor was.
Ouch.
Yeah. But it's funny with this piano. There is as little indeterminacy as possible built into it. I have no random number generators, nothing random built into it in any way, and it's not because I'm opposed, as all this other stuff I was talking about would indicate, but it's in part because one of the things that I'm interested in is this interface between us as humans, as sort of big pieces of biology, and these pieces of hardware that are accurate in ways that we're not. And what I'm interested in exploring is that interface, and I feel like any randomization that I introduce is going to sort of cloud that, especially with regards to timing. And also, I sometimes when I'm working with indeterminacy in my own instruments, I'll stumble on something and love it, and then simply not be able to find it again. Which is, I guess there's something wonderful and Cagean about that. But as a composer, I find it really frustrating because it might be something that I want to be able to use again or explore and twist in a certain way. And one of the things about the piano is that there's nothing indeterminate about it, and so you can recreate any state that you might have found, any place that you might have found with it. So that said, I think this instrument is looking to me like a platform for all sorts of interesting possibilities. And I think building in indeterminacy in certain ways is something that I know other people are going to want to do, and I think I'm going to want to do as time goes on.
Well, I think there's a certain amount of indeterminacy built into it just as an instrument that is being played by a human.
Right.
Because there's human indeterminacy, and when I was playing around with it, that was actually something I wanted to test was, if I play loud, does it behave differently? And it behaves differently in as much as it makes a louder sound like a piano does, but it doesn't do any computationally thing differently,
right.
Which I thought was an interesting decision for exactly the same thing that Sam was talking about. I think there is some indeterminacy built in, but it's all of a human input.
Well, and it could also be determined by how you're performing it. I mean, it's going to be one thing if you play it out on a piano keyboard, but if I use a pad controller, I'm going to get a totally different effect. Or if I write a quick intercept for the app in Max so that it maybe changes every 5,000th or so note value to something totally inappropriate.
Well, if you
Sam's
wanna
going to
get-
fire up his Michael Brecker EWI.
if you want to get really nerdy, it's indeterminate because it's going to have to produce noise at some point, right?
Yeah.
And how that noise is produced, unless you say this piece must be reproduced with like this brand of speaker and the electricity that they're being powered by this, there's always an indeterminacy in how it actually sounds based on the way the noise is being produced.
Yeah, in fact,
that's a super nerdy wormhole to go into, but it's true, I think.
It's funny. We worked fairly hard with this very problem or this question because I had worked on these pieces at home in my studio with headphones on, and then took them out in one sort of black box space and plugged them into one certain kind of speaker, and it really sounded pretty bad. And also, it was on a concert with other, real piano music, and it sounded particularly bad next to the real piano. And so we've undergone a number of cycles of experimenting with how to actually make it sound good, and also in different ways in different rooms. It's complicated. So yeah, there's all sorts. That's the thing. There's so many places for there to be variability. To this point, I've actually wanted to avoid introducing any variability into the actual instrument itself, consciously introducing any, just because there's so much otherwise. So you're talking about just how you play. One of the things that's interesting, you play a chord and it starts a metronome. The way you voice that chord is reflected in the metronome. So if you play a dominant seventh chord and you play the third really lightly, that third is going to be really light in the metronome as it comes out. So there is all this little bit of coloring, the shading that you can do just as a player, or that'll happen accidentally as a player. If you mask that with some kind of randomness, or if you introduce some kind of randomness into how the velocities are mapped or something, then all of a sudden you're like, well, I'm not sure what I'm doing and what the computer is doing.
Yeah,
that's brilliant.
So I think the logical next question is, when does the commissioning project for this instrument start? 'Cause I am in like Flynn.
Sweet. Yeah. Well, it's funny. I guess a year and a half ago, Adam played some of these at one of the So Percussion Summer Institutes that they have, and there's a real strong response to them, which is gratifying. But I was surprised by the number of people who said, "Wait, I want to write for this," that got me thinking. Wow. So how to make this not just for other people to play, but for other composers to work with. And as part of this release today of the record, there is a volume of really small pieces we're calling micro etudes that a dozen other composers have written for the instrument, and this has been so much fun because I made the instrument. I figure I know how it works and I know what people were going to want to do with it. Totally not. I mean, people came back with so many different things, and actually two of them wrote pieces for it that exploited a bug.
Now you can't fix it.
Yes.
Well, right, so and then they sent me the pieces, and I had discovered the bug in the meantime. They sent me the pieces, and I was like, oh no. So now I fixed the bug, but I had to introduce a way for that bug to be reproduced. Actually, it was really cool because the metronome before that would always play the same pitches that you play. But through one of the bugs that I had introduced by accident, you would get some transpositions. So you'd play a chord, and then your metronome would come back like octave transposed. Really?
Oh, I did that on accident when I was playing with it earlier. I thought it was deliberate.
No, well, that's right. Well, it is now. So now you can program that into it. But I had to go in and change the instrument because of these bugs that these composers had exploited. The pieces are really wonderful and interesting and really different from one another and really different from anything that I would have dreamed of. So, I don't have any money to commission people for this instrument, but we are putting it out there, and I'm hoping that people will write for it and, spur further development, come up with other ideas, exploit new bugs that I haven't yet found, and so on.
Well, we should say
very
that
cool.
people can find all of this stuff on your site that you can go to, and we'll have a link to this in the show notes. But people can go to manyarrowsmusic.com/nostalgicsynchronic, and you can download the bitKlavier software that makes all this stuff work, as well as a PDF of the score to Nostalgic Synchronic that we've been talking about, and there is a link to purchase the micro etudes that you just mentioned. So all this stuff is available. If you want to play with it, go grab it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the best thing about it. It's like, here's some toys I made. Go, you kids, go play.
Yeah, cool. I'm glad to hear you say that. I mean, this is a funny, I guess it's a CD release, and it is a CD release, and I'm going to say something here. I feel like as composers, there's today a real focus on presentation, a focus on putting on concerts, a focus on putting out records, and less of a focus on actually enabling music making, and trying to invite people in to explore and make music together, which is, it's fine. I mean, I'm a composer. I love putting on big concerts, and I like putting records out. But I'm also I'm a fiddler. I like playing fiddle tunes, and that's one of the things the fiddle world, there's a lot of performance, but at the heart of the fiddle world, there's really making music with other people, and not really worrying about performance first. And so I feel like this is the first time in this sort of part of my work where I've been able to put something out where I'm hoping that people will do just what you said. They'll download it, they'll actually get in and make music themselves and find their own things. My pieces, I'd love for people to play my pieces. I'm hoping the pieces are an inspiration and give a sense of what's possible and some ideas. But in the end, I'm much more excited if people are actually in there trying to make music themselves and using it in ways that I never would have thought of.
Like this global asynchronous jam session.
Yeah.
We're all getting in.
Yeah.
I love that. Well, listen, Dan Trueman, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. We really appreciate it. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. Is there anything that you have coming up that you want to plug before we let you go?
Oh, well, first, thank you guys. It's been great to talk to you. Thanks for having me for this. There's a release celebration, anybody in the New York area, on October 6th at the Le Poisson Rouge. Adam's going to play a bunch of these, and Steel Percussion's going to play. It'd be great to see a bunch of people there. But otherwise, I just hope people go check it out.
Absolutely. ManyArrowsMusic.com, and we'll have links to those in our show notes. Those are at SoundNotion.tv/SN. So if you are listening to this at home and wanting to know links to all of these things, we'll have links to all this stuff. We'll have links to, actually, the last time we spoke about Dan's music, we spoke with Eric Beach and Josh Quillen about Neither Anvil Nor Pulley, all the way back on SoundNotion 122.
Wow.
This is 217, so it's been a while. But we'll have links to those things and everything else we just spoke about today, including Chuck, which I'm going to spend some time poking at this weekend. And that's, again, all on our site, soundnotion.tv/SN. You can find us on Twitter. We're at SoundNotion. Ben is at B. Furman. Nate is at Innate Tree. Sam is at Housegoy. I personally am at Dave McDough. Dan, are you on Twitter? Can people follow you on the Twitter machine?
I don't tweet, I'm afraid.
No, that's all right. I should have asked before I put you on the spot. But we'll link to your site, and people can find many more useful things than tweets there.
Cool.
So
one thing I'll add, if that's all right, you were mentioning looking up Chuck. A lot of musicians, I think, find programming hard. and hard to get into. And text-based programming in particular can sometimes seem a bit forbidding. There's actually a great online course that just started this summer. It's a new company actually called Cadenze, Kadenze. And they have a course, Digital Programming for Artists and Musicians, and it's based in Chuck. It's a great course. It's made by Ajay Kapoor and Perry Cook. Ajay started the Machine Orchestra at Cal Arts, and Perry was one of my colleagues and mentors at Princeton. He started the laptop orchestra with me. It's a really great course, and I've gotten good reports from musicians who haven't done a lot of programming, but they want to get into it, and they've found that this has really helped them get into it. So again, in the spirit of really wanting people to be able to do it and not just use things or listen to things, I think it could be a way in for some people.
I love that. We will definitely link to that as well. Cool. So thank you so much to Dan for being with us, and thank you to you at home for listening. We really appreciate it. It's been another fine episode of SoundNotion. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you back next week.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Warner Brothers. Happy birthday to you.
I give up.
Oh, no.
Now we better hope that doesn't get overturned on appeal.
Right.
I know. I had my music theory classes sing it on video.
All right.
Wow.
Okay.
Dan, thank you so much for this. And I'm so glad that you mentioned the stuff about fiddling, because I was going to